I'm so delighted to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. And I did my master's degree at St. John's College in Annapolis, where you read a number of classic texts, including ones from the history of science, and discuss them and really dig in and ask the big questions. So I'm just delighted to be able to do that here. And I think my conversation partners for the evening are some of the best people anywhere to address these questions. So I had the privilege when I lived in Boston of hearing Cullen Buie speak a couple of times there. And what he said was so insightful that I think I could still quote some of it almost verbatim several years later. But I won't, because even better, you'll get to hear it directly from Cullen shortly. And then more recently, I've been just delighted to make the acquaintance of Marcelo Gleiser, and I'm really enjoying his book, The Island of Knowledge, which is a fascinating exploration of what it means for us to know as human beings, and also, as a bonus, gives you a tour of Greek philosophy and Renaissance cosmology, both things that I was delighted to revisit after studying them in a different context. So I'm just delighted to get to chat with both of you this evening. And since we're all scattered around the country in various places, and perhaps even beyond that, I thought it would be great to start by just briefly describing where you are geographically, and then sharing one project that you're really enjoying right now. That could be a scientific work, it could be a house project, it could be something like that. So I'll give you just a moment to think about that. And I'll say that I'm joining us with this group from Ithaca, New York, and I love summer theater, so the project I'm enjoying is figuring out how to see it on Zoom. So Marcelo, would you also share where you are and a project you're enjoying?
Sure, yes. So hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here again. I've done a few of these discussions in different schools around the country, and it's funny to be doing it from my own home, which is where I am right now at Hanover. So about 7 miles away from Dartmouth College in the mountains here, which is a very, very privileged place to be at this very moment that we're living in and experiencing together. And in terms of work that I've been doing recently, from a physics perspective, I've been trying to apply concepts from information theory to study the complexity of natural systems in very broad outlines. And in a more philosophical, less scientific approach, I'm working on a book with two colleagues, which we're calling The Blind Spot, which is about the places where science cannot reach, from a epistemological way, and what does that mean for our understanding of reality. So, basically about the limits of science, which is very pertinent to what we're doing today.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Cullen, where are you joining us from, and what's a project you're enjoying right now?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hannah. Really happy to be here. I must say, after your introduction, it's going to be hard to remain humble, but I will do my best. Joining from Cambridge, I'm on the faculty at MIT. I actually live in a dorm, which has been interesting. What it's been like to live in a dorm during the age of COVID-19. I'll talk about two things. I don't know if I'll call them projects. I'll talk about two things that are captivating and kind of really motivating me at the moment. One is I have a startup company which is using electric fields to deliver material into cells for cell therapies, where they will take cells from your body and re-engineer those cells to cure your cancer and other diseases. And we are working on a prototype of our commercial system that is supposed to launch within the next couple months. So that's been taking up a lot of my time. Another thing taking up my time has really been, I would say, you might call it this new civil rights movement, and all the talk and emphasis on race and social justice. It's not something new to me, but I will say this current moment has really shifted some of my focus to really thinking about how can I really make a larger scale impact, more than what I've done in the past. And so I've spent a lot of time. My wife and I, for example, spent an hour last night thinking about things that we can do, like personally. So Those are two things that I'm thinking about.
Well, those all sound like very important things to be engaged in right now, and I'm glad to hear that you are both working on those things. And as we dive into the question of intellectual humility, we do like big questions here at the Roundtable, and we'll start with a big one, which is how do you define intellectual humility? And I'll give a little bit of context on some of the things we've been discovering about it through the social sciences, and then I'm really looking forward to hear what you both have to say about it. So many of the folks on this call probably watched the 3-minute video, The Joy of Being Wrong, which is a very brief summary of some of the recent social sciences research and philosophical work on trying to understand the idea of intellectual humility. And I think in light of that research, we could kind of say that intellectual humility is a learned and practiced posture of mind that recognizes our current limitations and therefore lets us grow beyond them in our knowledge and our study. And so I'll tell one very brief story about that. Since I have a PhD in English literature, I am contractually obligated to have a literary example, and this is it. So in Dante's epic poem, The Divine Comedy, of course, the poet famously goes to visit a fictional version of heaven. And in Paradiso, the third book of the trilogy, he meets a scholar who has spent part of his earthly life advocating for a particular view of the cosmos. And we learn that in Dante's fictional story, one of the first things that person found out when he arrived in heaven was that he had been flatly wrong about how the cosmos works. Now, you may or may not believe in heaven. We welcome people from all perspectives on that. But I imagine for most of us, when we think about the idea of eternal bliss, the first thing that comes to mind is not being instantly proven wrong. But what's interesting in Dante is Dante tells us that this scholar smiled when he discovered that. And I think that's because the scholar got what we're starting to learn now through the social sciences about intellectual humility, that a chance to discover you're wrong is really wonderful if it comes with a broader and better understanding of how the universe works. So I think that's one brief story that kind of illustrates some of what we're learning about this. But I'm really interested to hear what both of you have to say about intellectual humility as people who spend your days studying the world through the natural sciences and certainly know a lot more about science than Dante did, as much as I love him. And so I'd like to hear how each of you define intellectual humility, and maybe if you can share one time when intellectual humility was helpful to you in some particular scientific research. And Marcelo, I thought we might start with you describing your famous island of knowledge metaphor here.
That's the punchline, but
oh, my apologies.
but that's okay. Let me say that intellectual humility for all of you out there, as you probably know, is not a very popular topic in academia. So I would say that Cullen and I are very brave out here to be talking about this because unfortunately the intellectual culture in academia, it's still dominated by a certain level of arrogance, not just within disciplines, but also across disciplines, you know. And this has been elaborated in an essay from 1959 from C.P. Snow, who talked about the two cultures, which is something that worries me a lot, which is the distancing between the sciences and the humanities, you know, in the sense that we have different narratives, we have different ways of talking to one another, and they do not include curiosity about what the other group is doing, you know, in the sense that we are forcing these barriers of knowledge that really didn't exist about 3 centuries ago. And that is a problem. So in terms of the definition of intellectual humility, I think it's the cultivated ability to embrace the fact that we know much less than we think we do. And because of that, to open ourselves to learning from others, you know, and not just from the way we think about things, but to have sort of a broader perspective of embracing different ways of knowing. And I think this is particularly important these days because many of the problems that we have in modern society, in the modern world, are not one-dimensional problems. They're not problems that can be fixed just from, say, a scientific perspective, but they really do need both the scientific and the humanistic approaches in order to make sense of what's going on. So when you talk about climate change, or when you talk about genetic engineering, which is something that Cullen knows much more than I do about, and when you talk about artificial intelligence and many other questions that we have that are so important to us in society, not just forgetting about the pandemic for a while, you know, and about what's going on, but the other questions, they are questions that do ask for a multidisciplinary approach. And it turns out that you have seen this, and we see this in academia a lot, where scientists do not want, a lot of scientists do not want to listen to, say, philosophers or historians or social scientists, and vice versa. And so one of the problems that I think we need to face is the fact that we need to move beyond the compartmentation of academia that we have created in the last, say, 200 years or so, you know, because we all lose with that. And our students love when you create conversations which transcend a certain discipline. So here at Dartmouth, I teach a course which is, you know, nicknamed, like in many other schools, a physics for poets class, where I talk about the history of science from the very beginning, you know, from creation myths of different civilizations through the Big Bang and beyond. And in that, I inject always a lot of philosophy, a lot of religion, and the students love to embrace the big questions that these conversations force them to think about. And so it is of interest, you know, to enrich the way we think about the world, to cultivate this intellectual humility, to understand that one of the fundamental properties of knowing is not knowing. And with that, you know, is basically the way you advance towards growing as a person and as an intellect, by assuming and understanding that perhaps your worldview needs a little um, retuning, you know. And I think when Cullen talked about social justice, I think this is one of the questions that absolutely we do need some very fundamental retuning of what we mean by that and how it can be applied in practice. As you said, you know, what can I do, you know, to make a difference and make a world a more socially justice place.
Yeah, Marcelo, I love all that, and you've been thinking about this longer than me. But I really like what you said about academia in particular. I was thinking about academia as an institution. We don't train our students to be humble. Like, you know, you think of what does a graduate study culminate with, or a PhD? It's a PhD thesis defense, right? You put up your dukes and you're going to fight for your ideas, fight for your life in front of these 3 or 4 faculty. And it's almost like when we look at ideas, we don't wrestle with ideas, like we snipe at them. Like we stand far away, like very impersonal, and like we try to kill them from far away. Like, whereas if you wrestled with the idea, you might lose, right? Like your idea might not be the one that comes out. And I think that's just there's some degree of, like, it's understandable, right? Like if you think of a PhD student, like they're going to spend a long time working on something. Of course, they're going to build up some level of knowledge in that space and some level of confidence that they are quote unquote correct. But we really have, we so couple our work to ourselves that it becomes difficult to be intellectually humble. Academia is just this place where we, you know, there are only so many fields where you put your name on all your work, right? Like musicians, right? They put their name on all their work. There's many artists put their name on all their work, and academics. And, you know, when you think about a lot of those fields, you see a lot of arrogance in those places where you put your name on everything. It's hard to disassociate your ideas from yourself. And I think that's one of the things that's needed for intellectual humility, the ability to decouple the idea or concept from you as a person. So I don't have too much to add to the I would say, to the definition, except that I can see in academia there's some kind of inherent problems that make it difficult for us to be humble. It's hard to be intellectually humble in academia these days. Because when you feel like you have to fight for your ideas and thus even for yourself all the time.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Can I continue that, Hannah? Is that the plan, right? That we have? No, I love that because I think we are trained to be skeptics. I mean, that one of the fundamental, qualities of a scientist is that you need to be skeptic. You need to be able to think independently and critically about the information that you're receiving. And so that is part of our training. But the problem begins when you confuse skepticism with some sort of intellectual vanity, and that's unfortunately quite rampant around, and it's funny if you think about it, because the more you learn about science, right, the more you realize that we know so little, right? And this is where this metaphor of the island of knowledge that Hannah mentioned before comes in, which is, if you imagine that what we have learned about the world and we keep learning about the world fits in an island, which is our island of knowledge. As any good island, it is surrounded by an ocean, in this case, the ocean of the unknown, the stuff that we don't know about the world. So science is very much a flirt with this unknown, with the fact that we are exploring the mysteries that surround us. And that's one of the beautiful things about science. But the paradox of knowledge is that as this island grows, so does the boundary between what we know and what we do not know, which means that as we learn more about the world, we become more equipped to ask questions that we couldn't even have contemplated before. And Cullen's field is a great example of that. I mean, think about doing what you're doing now 20 years ago. I think it would be quite impossible,
Yeah,
and
no way.
because,
Yeah.
right? I mean, why did that happen? Well, it happened because all these technologies were developed, and different kinds of knowledge were applied to these technologies, and hence this whole new way of thinking about illness and cure emerged from that, right? And that is a beautiful thing, but it only happens because we kept asking questions. And you only ask questions when you understand that you do not know enough. And the problem with intellectual arrogance is they say, I know it, I know the answer, the world is this way, and whatever you say is not going to change my mind because I have this notion that this is my worldview, and you get this entrenchment, and this entrenchment is a kind of blindness, right? Because you are not able to see the other or be able to be open to the other. And it's crazy because if you think about the history of science, the history of science is the history of failure. Yes, we learn a lot about it, but every scientific revolution, every big discovery that we have made, every changing worldview happens because we're able to overcome an older worldview because it was not correct or because it was incomplete. So it is all about being wrong, and you should be embracing that. And so when I nowadays, Cullen, I didn't do this earlier, I promise, but nowadays, I guess because I'm older and thinking more about this stuff, I make a point of talking about this stuff to my students, graduates and undergraduates, because it is this embracing of ignorance that makes knowledge grow. So if you entrench yourself in like, this is how the world is, and in high energy physics, okay, there is a lot of that. Like the world is made this way, and what's happening right now, it's a very interesting time. I don't want to go on for very long because for about 3 or 4 decades, we have had this prevalent idea that the world should obey certain symmetries, certain laws, and thousands of people have based their careers on this. And it turns out that the data is just not proving that idea correct. And so you imagine this, you spend 30 years of your life, right, working on something, convinced that this is the way the world operates, and then boom, nature comes and slaps you in the face and says, sorry, it's a great idea, but it may not correspond to the real world. And you have to have the intellectual openness and humility to move on and learn from data, because the ultimate word in science is always coming from nature and not from what we think nature should be like.
Yeah, that's hard. You know, even to draw from Hannah, from your your story from Dante, like you're not in heaven yet, and you get the rug pulled out from under you. That's got to be tough. I'd love to even like briefly, like when you were talking about the island. I've been to Hawaii. I'd love to extend the island metaphor just a hair. Just thinking about, you think what happens at that interface. It's violent, right? It's lava interfacing with the ocean. It's messy. Like there's no life happening there for a long time, like right at that interface. And so it's hard to work at those boundaries and understand what's happening. So like, yeah, I love that island analogy.
And it takes risk. It takes embracing risk, right? And one of the problems that we have as scientists is that most of the traditional ways of getting funded for science are very risk averse. So when you apply for a grant to NIH or NSF or DOE, they tend to be sort of uh, incremental steps, on something which is very well founded already, right? If you come up with some wild idea that could be right, but is somewhat risky, it will be much harder to get funded from that. So there is a whole system that is being built about being somewhat risk averse and conservative in the way that we move knowledge forward. And of course, there is a reason for that, which is to protect ourselves from a lot of crackpots there are quite a few of them. So I understand that. Um, but on the other hand, I think there should always be room for these more risky approaches to knowledge. And so, for example, Google has some laboratory where failure is celebrated, right? I forgot the name of the laboratory right now, but basically they get a bunch of people there, very creative people, and they can develop any idea that they want. And as long as they do it hard enough and seriously enough, if it doesn't work, that's awesome, because they actually tried and they're sticking their necks out to try to advance knowledge and create perhaps a new product in their case, but knowing that most of the new ideas are wrong. Right, and
When
that's
this,
another thing that is interesting. That right, Cullen is another one that can tell you this. We as scientists, I can tell you that almost all of our ideas are wrong. Right,
The good
very
ones.
very few of them work.
The good ones are almost always wrong, because if you could if you could predict it's going to work, it's not out there enough. You're not pushing the boundary enough if you can predict that it's going to work.
this reminds me, Cullen, of a story I've heard you tell before about how early in graduate school you were given a task of working on a new kind of pump for fuel cells that had no moving parts. And one of the most recent people to try and do that, another scientist, told you he didn't think that was ever going to work, that particular approach to it. And it strikes me that it was probably a pretty big risk for you to work on that project. It seems like it probably took a lot of confidence and a lot of intellectual humility. How did that turn out? And could you talk a little bit about that perceived tension between confidence and humility and how that worked out in that project?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the specific thing and then branch out into that tension. And it was funny, in that specific area is my first year of graduate school, and there was a postdoc who had already worked on this funded project. Actually, there were two postdocs, and they hadn't been able to get it to work, but they were moving on in their academic careers. And so I was talking to them for advice on what to do, and they're like, "Yeah, I don't think this is going to work. Good luck," on their way out of the door. But I don't know if this was so much intellectual humility or confidence. I mean, my advisor said, "Okay, get it done." So I was just a good graduate student trying to get it done and finish my degree. So it ultimately did work out. It took a lot of time. It took a couple years for it ultimately to work, 2 years, but it did work in the end. But branching out and thinking like how you keep these things in tension, for me, I have to leverage my faith, my Christianity, for that. And it comes down to the fact that, I believe in God, and I'm made in the image of God. And so that means two things. One, it means Me being made in the image of God, I have something to offer the world. And so I can have confidence, but I'm also made in the image of God. I am not God. So I'm not all knowing. I'm not all powerful. I'm not omnipotent. So I don't know everything. And also, Hannah, you and Marcelo, you guys are both made in the image of God. You guys know stuff that I need to learn. So I feel like that's how I keep that confidence and that tension in place. Is I'm made in the image of God, so I have something to bring, but so are you. So I have something to learn from you. And that's kind of how I try to keep those things kind of in balance.
Thanks so much, Cullen. Marcelo, I'm curious what in your personal philosophy encourages you towards intellectual humility. You've talked some about the value of failure. I'd love to hear more about your philosophy and how you think that through.
Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that as a student, I was never the best in class. I always had to struggle to learn stuff, and it took a lot of hard work for me to have a career as a scientist. Go through all the hurdles, right? There's quite a few of them, and so I think the way I position myself is a person that understands his own limitations, right? So I know what I am capable of to a certain extent, but I also know that if I don't push my boundaries as a person, I cannot grow and learn more. So there is a level of confidence that we need to have. And I guess, Cullen, when that guy stepped out of your office, I imagine that you said, okay, I got to do this. And you have to have both faith in the idea and and stubbornness, right? I mean, you have to kind of be that person that will try as hard as you can, and understand that you're not always going to be successful, and be okay with that. And to me, that has been always the case. And if I could even extend the island of knowledge metaphor just a little bit more, we talked about the knowns, we talked about the unknowns, but within the ocean of the unknowns, there are also what I call the regions of the unknowables. So there are several questions that you can formulate, even within the scientific narrative, that cannot be answered within science, right? And they're very reasonable questions. I mean, one of them, obviously, that everybody knows about is, how did the Big Bang bang? How was what happened at the origin of the universe? Can we create or develop a scientific model that really gives you an explanation or a description that is self-contained? Right? You can give an operational description of it. You can build models which are incredibly super simplified accounts of what really happened there. But is that enough? Right? So that's one. Another obvious one is also within cosmology, is that because the speed of light is finite, even though it's very big, we live in a bubble of information, which is the amount of time light had to travel from the Big Bang outwards or inwards towards us. And so we do not know, even though we can infer what's out there, we cannot know for sure what's outside this bubble. And there are quite a few of those questions. I could go on, but the point is that understanding that there are unknowables, that science is not something that has been designed to have all the answers, is incredibly important in this journey towards intellectual humility. That perhaps the more important part of this is to have the curiosity to always learn more. So, as Tom Stoppard said in the play, since you're an English PhD, Tom Stoppard, in his play Arcadia, one of the characters says something like, "It's wanting to know that makes us matter." And I think that is absolutely essential. And I live my life by that motto. I'm always wanting to know. And the only way you can be open to learn more is to start from the premise that you do not know enough. And to not know enough and to understand that, you have to be intellectually humble.
Arcadia is one of my favorite plays. I see it every time I get the chance, so I'm delighted that you mentioned it. So as we're wrestling with this, it strikes me that both of you have kind of pointed to some of the ways that academic systems can kind of push us towards we might call it sometimes a systemic hubris. You know, this year we're rightly in a conversation about systemic problems in American society that perpetuate racial injustice or marginalize our fellow citizens in other ways. And I'm wondering if there's some way in which academia might sometimes push us that way through a certainty about answers. Do you think that is an issue? If it is, you know, how could we sort of reorient the academy towards systemic humility, and how might that benefit our communities as we try to use our academic knowledge to serve?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think part of it, we have to think about like what are our motivations in engaging these issues. As academics, do we feel like, are we stepping in as like the savior? Because that's not going to lead to humility, right? That's not going to lead to intellectual humility. Do we feel we have actually something to learn from the process and from the world, and from the world that we say we're trying to serve? I'll go back to the being made in the image of God, that, you know, kind of example that I talked about earlier. Like when we go out and we, for example, when we want to do, let's say if we want to do justice in the case of, let's say we're talking about diversity in our departments, our academic departments. Like, do you look at it as, okay, we need to hire people that don't look like us because that'll be good for them? Or do you do it because that will be good for everyone? That's good for the world, right? I think it's very easy to get into this posture of, well, we do this work because that'll be good for them. It's charity, right? We're going to help these poor souls. We're going to lift them up through our knowledge and our intellect and our training, and out of the goodness of our heart, not realizing that the people that we're trying to help have so much to give to us, right? There's so much for us to learn. I think we should start thinking of approaching these problems from the perspective that we are actually the ones who are lacking, rather than it's the world that's lacking. We tend to look at it, the world is lacking, we're going to step in and fix everything. But what if we flipped it a little bit and said, we're the ones lacking by not having these different communities in our midst? It's our science, it's our philosophy, it's our engineering, it's our chemistry that's lacking. It's not them. Like, we need them just as much as they need us. Like we're really all in this together. And I think that would be, ultimately the activities might look exactly the same, but I think the posture of your heart is different when you walk into it thinking that I am really benefiting from this as well. It's not just about me serving and donating my big brain to this problem.
Thank you so much for that, Cullen. Marcelo, any brief thoughts on that? And then I have one last question I want to ask the two of you.
Sure. So very briefly, so a few years ago, in terms of transforming thoughts into actions in this area, you know, a few years ago, I was fortunate to get a grant from the John Templeton Foundation to start an institute at Dartmouth called the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, with the mission of bringing the sciences and the humanities in what we call constructive engagement. And what we do all sorts of different things, but one of the things that we do is we promote these public dialogues where we bring together scientists and humanists to talk about a big question. So, for example, what is the nature of faith? Or what is the future of humanity? Or should machines think? Is there life elsewhere, and what does that mean to us if this life is intelligent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of big questions about existence that are interesting from all different ways of thinking about them, not just a scientific, but also a humanistic, you know, from philosophers, historians, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, this has been an incredibly rich experience, not just personally, because I met all these amazing people along the way, but also to the audiences. You know, we would take this to public venues across the country, and it was just fascinating to see the level of engagement and the level of curiosity and need that people have for this kind of transdisciplinary conversation. So these barriers need to go down, you know, and for that to happen, people have to be open, as Cullen just said, you know, to learn from the other, not just this is going to be good for me and my department. No, this is going to enrich me as a human being. and perhaps also intellectually, and this has been a wonderful experiment. I'm kind of sorry that the we call ourselves ICE because this happened before 2016,
Mm.
and so we wanted to change the name to DICE, but for many particular reasons we couldn't. But it's ice.dartmouth.edu, and people can take a look at what it is, exactly what we do. But it's in a sense boots on the ground, trying to bring down a little bit those big academic walls.